guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Normally, I would say that I hope you're all doing well, but given the events of the past few weeks, including the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests that have been happening across America and social media and the world, in light of all of those things, I hope that you are holding up as well as you possibly can be. You know, these really feel like remarkable times that we're living through, marked by immeasurable grief and heartbreak, but I'm also genuinely hopeful that we can eventually look back on this moment as a turning point. And that depends on whether we all continue to stay engaged and keep fighting for the changes and reforms that members of the Black community have been calling for and fighting for decades. So while we all reflect on and make plans for what we can be doing on a personal, professional, and local level, not just now, but in the coming weeks and months and years, I'm going to link some Black Lives Matter resources down below, including petitions to sign, places to donate, some articles that I have found very illuminating, and some books to check out if you're interested in deepening your understanding of the history of systemic racism in America. I'm also going to link a couple of videos below that speak to some of the conversations that have been happening throughout the online bookish community. One is from Bree Hill and the other is from Seiji at The Artisan Geek. I encourage you to watch those videos and to also check out their channels more generally. Bree is an incredible voice in the romance reader community, and Seiji reads a lot of literary fiction and classics, as well as some cool nonfiction and YA. Today, I also wanted to talk about Citizen, an American Lyric by Claudia Rankine, which is a book that I picked up in the midst of everything that's been happening. And I wanted to preface this with a quick note about all of the anti-racist reading lists that have been going around, and a piece that Lauren Michelle Jackson wrote for Vulture in response to those lists called "What is an Anti-Racist Reading List For?" I encourage you to read that piece in full, and if you are a non-Black person, to interrogate the lens through which you're reading Black authors. Ideally, you read Black authors through as many different lenses as you would read any other author, and recognize that while books like How to Be an Anti-Racist are meant to be instructional, and while books like The New Jim Crow help to fill some of the glaring gaps in the standard U.S. history syllabus, to read a novel like The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison or a book of poetry like Citizen through a pedagogical lens where the primary goal is to educate or enlighten yourself, to do that does a disservice to those writers and those books. And I just wanted to mention that ongoing conversation because how we approach reading Black writers also has a bearing on how we talk about Black writers. And Citizen in particular was a work that was often described as timely when it first came out in October 2014, just a couple of months after the deaths of Eric Garner in New York and Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And now, more than 5 years later, this book is still being called timely and urgent. And the two poems from it that I've seen most widely shared on social media recently are the two poems that speak most explicitly to the ongoing death of Black men at the hands of the police. And while certainly the force of those poems hits you like a sledgehammer in the context of everything that's happening right now, when you read Citizen in its entirety, when you immerse yourself in Claudia Rankine's language, in the way that she structures her poems, what you get beyond the urgency of a singular moment is a sense of that moment as part of a continuum of lived experiences that run through past, present, and future. The way that race and identity operate in America is not confined to particular events or particular years or particular summers. Instead, it permeates everything, and it permeates everyone's life every single day. Even the book's cover art, I think, nods to that sense of timelessness and through lines, because although the image of a hoodie is probably, for many people, very evocative of the death of Trayvon Martin in 2012, the work featured here is actually a sculpture from 1993 called In the Hood by David Hammons. And I think the title and subtitle of this book, Citizen: An American Lyric, also assert a universality and a lack of qualification that asks you to consider this book not just as a book about Black Lives Matter, or not just as a book that falls under the subcategory of African American literature or African American experience. Rather, it asks you to read these poems as American literature, as the American experience, and as a portrait of American citizenship in the 21st century. So all that being said, I want to talk a little bit about the content of these poems and also about Claudia Rankine's use of language and form, and how all three of those things coalesce into this picture of American life and create a sense of a continuum of lived experiences. This book opens with a series of poems detailing the microaggressions that are an all too common part of the everyday Black experience in America. Notably, the book starts with a memory of one such moment from childhood, with another student telling the you that is the central consciousness of this book that, quote, "You smell good and have features more like a white person." The following poems then go on to attest to a succession of similar indignities: a friend calling you by the name of their Black housekeeper, a well-meaning neighbor calling the cops on a family friend who is babysitting your child for the afternoon, a colleague telling you, quote, "His dean is making him hire a person of color when there are so many great writers out there." And Rankine builds up these moments that on the surface may appear to be small transgressions, but which are in fact moments of rupture and obliteration and betrayal. And you start to feel how these moments accumulate and how they bear down on both the consciousness and the body. She says, "You take in things you don't want all the time. The second you hear or see some ordinary moment, all its intended targets, all the meanings behind the retreating seconds, as far as you are able to see, come into focus. Hold up. Did you just hear? Did you just say? Did you just see? Did you just do that?" Then the voice in your head silently tells you to take your foot off your throat because just getting along shouldn't be an ambition. And it's worth noting that although such moments might initially seem like pieces of autobiography, Claudia Rankine has stated that those poems, the ones that read like a kind of everyday anthropology, are in fact drawn from conversations that she conducted with friends and acquaintances about moments in which race interrupted an otherwise ordinary incident, which makes a lot of sense because as the book goes on, the poems are constantly shifting between the personal and the universal, between the intimate and the shared, the local and the global, and between a kind of external and internal interrogation. And beyond those moments of seemingly personal experiences, Rankine turns her critical eye to collective cultural moments or touchstones. Things like the Gina 6 or the death of Trayvon Martin or the country's response to the tragedy of Hurricane Katrina. Most memorably, Rankine looks at Serena Williams as a figure in the collective consciousness. She probes into Serena's infamous foot foul during the 2009 US Open, and she then expertly excavates the years upon years of small insults and microaggressions that led up to that moment. She considers Serena as a supreme talent reduced to the stereotype of the angry Black woman. She considers Serena as this Black body thrown against a sharp white background, to paraphrase the Zora Neale Hurston quote that Rankine invokes. And as she does in the Serena Williams poem, Rankine presents these broader cultural flashpoints not as singular ahistorical events, but again as this accumulation of all of the histories and experiences that came before and that exist alongside them. And in that way, she draws a direct line between the kind of racism that Serena Williams experiences on center court, the racism of the country's negligent response to Hurricane Katrina, and the racism that the you of the poem experiences when a man cuts in front of her at the drugstore because he just didn't see her. And all of that also plays into the interesting ways that Claudia Rankine invokes W.E.B. Du Bois's idea of double consciousness. Citizen looks at how, in many ways, your identity and experiences as a Black person in America are not solely your own. What happens to Serena when an umpire calls a BS foot foul, what builds up on Serena's shoulders over the years also builds up on your own personal sense of exhaustion. Rankine also explores the tension of being invisible and hypervisible as a Black person in America, the stress of having to fight to be seen, and then the counter stress of not being able to control how that visibility is perceived by others. And throughout the book, with every seemingly tiny microaggression endured, Rankine underlines the way in which Black consciousness is constantly having to navigate or prepare itself for the rupture of microaggression or something worse, for the unwelcome reminder that how you are seeing and experiencing a moment is not necessarily the same way another person is seeing and experiencing that same moment. Underscoring all of these themes and ideas is Claudia Rankine's masterful and dynamic use of language, form, and structure. Most notable in terms of language is her use of the second person throughout most of the book, which for some readers might serve as a kind of recognition or catharsis, a kind of acknowledgement and affirmation of their lived experiences. And for other readers, namely non-Black readers, that constant use of you is very intimate, at times inviting and at times accusatory. Either way, it implicates you and it destabilizes your presumed perspective. It forces an expansion of your consciousness and also drives home how much race is a part of your everyday as well, how you are also part of this broader daily continuum. And there are moments when that you of the second person does slip between a presumed Black female narrator and the person that she is accusing or speaking to. And that slippage adds an additional layer of destabilization to Rankine's words, a kind of unsteadiness of ground that jolts you out of your presumed consciousness or out of a sense of complacency and forces you to actively locate where you are in the poem. That destabilizing effect is also echoed in the structure of the poems, which are initially very direct and written out in a kind of straightforward prose that you might expect from an essay, but those poems, which are often recounting a concrete experience in the external world, then start to give way to a more deconstructed kind of verse and writing and meditation that delves into how the internal tries to grapple with the external. Throughout, Claudia Rankine also utilizes mixed media and snippets of text from other writers as a means of underscoring her own words or destabilizing the reader's understanding of them. And nowhere is this use of visual elements more effective than in her poem about French soccer star Zinedine Zidane, who famously headbutted Italian player Marco Materazzi during the 2006 World Cup. Rankine replays this moment with frame-by-frame images of the instant, juxtaposed with quotes from writers like James Baldwin and Frederick Douglass, quotes from Zidane himself, and from lip readers whose interpretations suggest that it was Materazzi's use of an ethnic slur that set off Zidane's headbutt. And what I love about this poem is that it encapsulates so much of what the whole book does, which is to zero in on a particular moment and then widen the lens, in this case through the incorporation of the voices of some some long-dead writers whose words still bear witness to the modern moment. Just as the voices of those writers in the Zidane poem serve as a kind of echo, so do the works of other artists throughout the book contribute to that overarching sense of collective voices and a collective citizenry, to a kind of artistic tradition and inheritance, and to the ongoing continuum of Black American history and experience. And the effect of it all together is profoundly powerful. And I have to say, between this and a couple of other books of poetry I've read recently, I'm really finding myself drawn to this genre far more than I have been in the past. And I think Citizen is a perfect example of how poetry has the ability to distill ideas and experiences and emotions down and contain them within this incredibly intentional economy of words, while at the same time having the power to evoke multitudes, to set off these vibrations of meaning and emotional impact that resonate far beyond the confines of text on a page. You know, in that vein, for me, reading an excellent book of poetry like Citizen almost has the effect of ringing a gong inside of you, where you're kind of initially right away hit with the lyricism or sonic force of the words, but then you also experience those reverberations of meaning or insight or understanding over a much longer period of time. I don't know if that metaphor makes sense. I'm clearly not a poet myself, but I've been enjoying the way that poetry forces you to grapple with it and to slow down and to sit with it and to reread and revisit it over time, especially in a book like Citizen, which I am sure I'm only barely scratching the surface of. But I guess this is just my long-winded way of saying that I highly recommend Citizen, an American Lyric by Claudia Rankine, not just for this moment, but for any moment. If you've read it already, I would love to hear your thoughts on it, particularly if you're someone who reads or has studied more poetry than I have, and if you have any additional insights into everything that's going on in the book, because there are certainly plenty of limits to how useful my thoughts on this book are. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Please take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again soon.